Hey everyone, I'm Pixel. For those of you that don't know, I've been involved in the Guild Wars 2 community for a few years now, and while I'm best known for being one of the bigger advocates for PvE Willbender, I'm here today to go over something a bit bigger in scope than that: the design for each of the new elite specializations releasing in Visions of Eternity. This is the first time we've seen new elite specs since End of Dragons released in 2022, and as I'm sure you can tell by the timestamp at the bottom of the video, I'm very excited about it. I also just have a big passion for game design, so I felt like the lead-in to the Elite Specialization beta would be a great opportunity to go into what makes each of these elite specs tick, partially as feedback on each design, but also just as a fun exercise in breaking down what makes for a compelling elite spec in the first place, especially in endgame PvE. And just to be clear, from now on I'm going to refer to endgame PvE as just PvE, not because I don't like open world or convergences, but because instanced endgame PvE content tends to be where balance changes have the most impact, so that's where I'm going to focus my attention. With that all out of the way, let's get started. Firstly, these are all preliminary opinions, subject to change both over the course of the beta and after it, so while I did put a lot of love and effort into this video, I'm under no illusion that these opinions are even remotely set in stone. Also, I absolutely do know this is a long video. I've included timestamps to each elite specialization, so if you're only interested in one particular elite spec or one build, you can feel free to just jump right to it. As I mentioned before, this is a design exercise, not a balance criticism, which is why I'm comfortable posting this before anyone has spent hands-on time with the upcoming elite specs. Design is easier to evaluate on paper than actual numerical performance, though I will mention numbers when it's relevant to the intended design goals. And with enough endgame experience, it's reasonably easy to make an educated guess on what some builds will want. There's only so many traits, skills, and weapons that are synergistic within a given kit, but it's also just for fun. I'm only one player, and any changes that I suggest aren't going to be implemented without careful consideration by ArenaNet and general consensus from the community. Hopefully, this design exercise gets the community to think more broadly about what makes for strong and compelling elite spec design, not just during and after the beta, but also for the specs you currently enjoy spending your time with. And while I know a lot of people might think it's too soon to make a video like this, I want to be able to get this out prior to the beta so I can review them again after the fact, just to see what's changed, and then once more after Visions of Eternity releases to hopefully plot a timeline for the design of each of the elite specializations. Don't worry, seeing as this serves for a lot of the groundwork I'll probably end up building from, this will almost certainly be much shorter videos. Lastly, I'm going to be approaching this as holistically as I can, but largely with a focus on PvE since that's where my personal experience lies. I'm also not going to be fully redesigning any of the elite specializations. I'm much more interested in trying to dig into what we're actually going to be getting. For each elite specialization, I want to cover its intended design goals, as well as what holes that spec can fill. Both of these are reasonable steps that ANet themselves have almost assuredly taken in their own development process, so in order to work from the same basis as them, I'd like to set those criteria for myself as well. Troubador is an interesting one. It's true that Mesmer doesn't have a dedicated elite specialization designed specifically for healing and support. Necromancer has assumed this mantle, but as stated by CMC and Trig in the dev stream, they feel like it stretched Chrono a bit thin, and that's an assessment I fundamentally agree with. I do like Chrono as a healer and support build, but it's not a spec I think should be primarily focused around that role, because it fundamentally has more access to its tools than other Mesmer supports due to improved alacrity and continuum shift, but we'll get back to Chrono later. Troubador's intended goal is to supplant Necromancer as the de facto healing specialization, with a bit of attention towards leaving room for a power build with access to its traits Shredding and Fortissimo. Condi might exist depending on the tuning of Mayhem, but Shredding seems more immediately powerful to me, so I'm going to presume that's the intended design space for instance PvE damage or boon DPS builds. I do like this design space. Every Mesmer elite specialization can build for both power and condition nowadays, with Mirage slanted more towards conditions, so biasing Troubador for power gives Mesmer a good balance of its damage types. I really like how they're distributing traits within its trait line as well. No traits within a given tier feel redundant with the others, and that's something very important to making a spec compelling in different endgame modes. I also like that instrument management taps into the same gameplay fantasy as managing clones, except it sort of inverts the relationship into building towards a more powerful, persistent threat, rather than building up to cash in all at once, sort of like Mirage or Necromancer. This gives it a different gameplay loop in a way that implicitly helps it stand out against its peers, something that's absolutely at a premium in a world with 4 elite specializations per class. It's also a smart decision to have the alacrity come from Harp, rather than something the build already wants to do, like Chrono getting rewarded for shattering when it already shatters plenty often. As a result, alacrity DPS and pure DPS Troubador play differently based on how many notes they're able to generate and spend. This is good. More archetypes within a spec lets players find rotations that match their playstyle. There is a bit of concern regarding the exact duration of Love Song's alacrity for boon DPS builds, since there's a chance that the build will have so much alacrity that maintaining Harp doesn't actually cost much in practice if you don't need to spend 3 notes on it. But that's a balance concern best saved for after the beta. The important thing here is, on paper, the design of Love Song does a lot to help differentiate the 2 builds, and that's great for the future of the spec and how many different playstyles it has. Unfortunately, that's where the positives for Troubador's alacrity end. I'm not here to arbitrate whether or not alacrity and/or quickness have room in endgame PvE. That's the paradigm the game is designed around, so I'm going to approach it at those terms. What I am concerned about regarding alacrity is something that other, far more experienced players with Mesmer have articulated as well: the dreaded boon share build. Endgame PvE has seen this a few times, from old school Through My Wrath Guardian stacking to EOD era Catalyst, followed in short order by Bladesworn. Troubador having innate access to alacrity from Love Song, quickness from Time Warp, and boon extension on Hold the Note makes its ability to work in this style of composition even more scary than any of the aforementioned builds. This means that a stack of Troubadors can feasibly upkeep alacrity, quickness, and with a little extra help, every other boon in the game. We've seen how discouraging endgame content, especially for high-level players grinding clears, can be when comps homogenize into stacking one elite specialization regardless of encounter, and Troubador runs the risk of repeating this all over again. Not only that though, Troubador would become the 3rd Mesmer elite spec to provide access to alacrity, something that would cause it to compete against Mirage in the exact same role as well as Chronomancer. ArenaNet has mentioned that they want to rein in Chrono's identity to make room for Troubador, something I do think would be a net benefit for the game for sure. But short of removing alacrity from Chronomancer entirely, which I don't think is necessary or smart to do, this is just going to put Mirage at odds with Troubador. Both of these problems are much more easily solved by just making Troubador a quickness specialization instead. Switching alacrity to quickness solves the internal role competition within Mesmer, while letting Chrono keep access to both quickness and alacrity, something that makes it implicitly valuable among other boon options regardless of the metagame. Heal Chrono does need a nerf, but removing one of its 2 available primary boons doesn't stop it from being a problem, it just makes building a composition around it a bit more tiresome. In short, switch alacrity to quickness to prevent boon stacking Troubador comps from threatening to become the endgame meta at a moment's notice, and to stop it from competing internally with Mirage. There's also the threat of Tale of the August Queen being too strong, as Distortion Share has often proven to be, but as stated in the dev stream, they seem to be aware of this and are willing to walk it back if it's a problem, so I don't want to draw too much attention to it. The rest of the spec seems awesome and very well realized. Huge props to ANet for what they've designed here. The reception to Luminary seems a bit mixed. While a fair few people are really happy about it, plenty more think ANet is leaving a lot on the table. By my estimation, there's immense value in what I've come to call core plus specializations, specs that key into the same fantasy and similar play patterns as the core profession, but just modernize them a bit. These are great, lots of people are drawn to the core classes for a reason, so giving them an easy landing point if they just want more of the same is smart design. Additionally, I like that Luminary is an alacrity build with an intended support build path. Alacrity Willbender works due to unintuitive interactions across traits that don't immediately read as synergistic, and its heal build is a little bit janky as a result. But Luminary's support path is much more purposeful and considered, and I like giving Guardian-specific and deliberate access to a heal alacrity build as a result. The issue arises when you don't give the aforementioned core plus specializations much to alter the texture of how they're played. Spellbreaker, what I would consider to be the most core plus specialization in the game, at least has full counter, a skill both inextricable from the spec and one that can't be used in its benchmark rotation. As a result, it changes how you think about adrenaline throughout an encounter. You always need to consider whether or not you'll want full counter in the next couple of seconds, so you adjust your play accordingly. This is small, but the way it reframes how you think about the spec is quite large, so it succeeds as a core plus specialization. Luminary, unfortunately, doesn't really have this. Due to Luminary penalizing you the more you use the weapons inside of Radiant Shroud, you're going to want to either minimize time spent in Shroud, or spend as much time in Shroud as possible repeatedly using the one skill that actually results in net positive DPS, neither of which is adding a whole lot of texture. Granted, a healing Luminary build engages with the system in more interesting ways, since you might want different things out of Radiant Shroud each time you enter, but that leaves DPS Luminary pretty high and dry as far as giving it interesting things to engage with. This would be fine as a baseline, but Luminary doesn't really have traits that engage with this in interesting ways either, so with that, let's go over the traits. The major adept traits on Luminary are all defensive. There is an interaction between Shining Restoration providing light auras and a Grandmaster trait that converts light auras to damage later on, but I'll get there in a bit. While all three do change the ways in which this build is survivable in PvP modes, doing so 3 times in the same tier comes at a big opportunity cost. The more functional overlap there is between traits, the less you're making compelling buildcraft decisions. As such, Persistent Blessing and Shimmering Stances are both largely accomplishing the same goal, even in PvP modes. Shimmering stances should likely stay, because without it, Luminary would be forced into bringing either Hold the Line or Hammer to provide protection as a heal build, something Willmender does actually need to do, and that's restrictive in a way it doesn't need to be. Shining Restoration can also probably stay, because a predictable source of light aura helps with the Grandmaster I mentioned briefly earlier, but with the prior two having more immediate value, there's likely room for a more directly offensive trait on the slot presently occupied by Persistent Blessing. The Master Adept traits suffer similarly from this lack of meaningful choice. Empowered Armaments is a damage modifier, which is good for the spec, but the other two are, yet again, more survivability. Steadfast Recovery providing healing with Resolution and Protection is fun, and Resolution is a big help to PvP Guardian, so this trait should probably stay, but Purging Light is just allied Condi Cleanse. This is not something Guardian needs help with. With our plethora of light fields, not to mention Absolute Resolve and Solar Storm, support Guardian really does not need help cleansing more conditions. I like the presence of a trait that cares about light auras where Purging Light currently is, but additional light aura access would do a lot more for this sort of build than a mediocre redundant payoff does. For example, a Luminary trait that synergizes directly with something in Radiance, so it could get some extra value from that trait line, which has the most direct support for light auras, would help this substantially. But as it stands, there's not really enough access to the light auras we'd need for such a build to really have its own unique gameplay texture. Luminary Shroud does provide one extra leap finisher on Shroud 4's flipover skill for us to have one more light aura generator, but that's pretty limited access in the grand scheme of the build. The Grandmaster traits are all, actually, quite good, if a bit unsupported by the other traits leading up to them. Illuminating Inspiration gives Luminary boon DPS and heal builds a unique play pattern where they're trying to keep all of the Virtue skills on cooldown, and Master at Arms provides a direct damage buffing trait if you use Virtue skills in conjunction with the Shroud weapons, but I've buried the lead long enough regarding Sovereign of Light. It's the Light Auras Matter payoff trait, and I'm quite happy with its inclusion. It's always fun seeing some new toy that asks you to reconsider something you haven't thought about in a long time. For example, Relic of the Steam Shrieker or Scrapper's Kinetic Accelerators asking you to care about combo fields or finishers are a great example of the value of tapping into forgotten gameplay systems. It needs a bit more help, but the trait is cool and gives a very interesting direction for some Luminary DPS builds. I do wish that Master of Arms or Illuminating Inspiration refunded some of their Shroud cooldown as well, so there's a build that gets to use Radiant Shroud a bit more aggressively, but overall these are solid Grandmasters. They just need a few of the lower tier traits to tie the whole specialization together. Galeshot is a really fascinating spec. I went from hardly interested in it to very excited for it in very short order. I love what Galebow offers, I adore Mistral as a skill, I like the flavor of a ranger finally fighting at range. There's just a lot here to be excited for. The E-spec locked weapon paradigm is interesting too, and while Bladesworn feels a little underbaked, a lot of its ideas seem a lot more crystallized in the Galeshot. Galeshot's intended gameplay purpose seems a lot clearer to me. You care about swiftness, super speed, going fast, and shooting big projectiles, with 3 major build paths indicated by its 3 Grandmaster traits. 1. Cloudburst Galebow camping, a quickness DPS where you cash in on Galeshot's resources very frequently, and ostensibly generate them just as frequently to keep pace. 2. Firebrand Tome combo Gale Force DPS, where sort of like Firebrand Tome, you cap out your Galebow stacks, dump them into a big combo, and then unload your strongest skills under the subsequent Gale Force buff. And 3. Shrike plus Mistral projectile spam DPS. All of these are awesome build paths, but there's a few issues that arise when you try to evaluate how each of the lower ranked traits interact with these build-defining Grandmasters. For our Adept traits, it looks like the only one that has any value in PvE is Wuthering Wind. That's fine, I'm not opposed to one trait being the de facto option, but Joy of Movement and Feel the Rush do seem very similar. I'll defer to the more PvP-focused players on their criticism here, but I think there's likely a world where these two could be merged into one trait to leave room for something else interesting in Galeshot's kit. But that's outside the scope of the kinds of feedback I'm able to provide, so let's just say Wuthering Wind is mandatory and move on. The master traits are where things get a little bit more muddy. I like the intent of all of these traits, and it does seem like they all have clear homes. Quick DPS would take Flock Together since it's an AoE quickness source, Shrike plus Mistral takes Perilous Skies for more projectiles, and the combo Gale Force build wants access to the arrows provided by Fetch. Provided the 2 arrows are impactful enough. This number might need to be tuned, as fundamentally Gale Force is likely to be the most arrow-hungry build, but this sort of falls apart when you look closer. First, Flock Together's ICD makes the quickness it provides pretty paltry, but even then, it and Cloudburst in combination are a ludicrous volume of quickness, to the point where Flock Together is borderline useless to the build, leading to the build likely preferring one of the other 2 traits. This trait might be better providing other offensive boons like Fury or Might, so Cloudburst Quickness has a reason to take it to support its group beyond redundant quickness access. Shrike is the other Grandmaster trait that concerns me, both in terms of its weapon access as well as its companion traits. First, Mistral seems to be the skill that keys most into this play pattern, but Perilous Skies, the other immediate trait you'd think to take on a projectile spam build, shoots a skill up into the air that rains down, much like Barrage and Longbow. These two skills shoot lots of projectiles, but based on how those projectiles fire, it's either extraordinarily difficult or even impossible to get these skills to be affected by Mistral. So not only am I concerned that Perilous Skies doesn't have a home with the Grandmaster trait that most immediately cares about projectiles, but Longbow might not as well. Not to mention that Longbow is certainly a weapon that feels left in the past, with odd canceling behavior on barrage, clunky skill roots scattered about, and just lackluster performance compared to hammer, axes, spear, maces, and even greatsword. While it's definitely the most directly synergistic with Shrike, that now poses the problem of the trait driving players towards engaging with a weapon that is both weak and dated. Not a great look. Lastly, as a sort of general issue with an elite specialization this focused on range damage, we have to talk about the elephant in the room: stacking in endgame PvE. Stacking is critically important in endgame PvE, and a build that encourages players to play at range and move around a lot runs the risk of those players either not receiving boons from the group in those modes, or, in the case of Cloudburst Quickness DPS, not providing them to their allies in the first place. There is technically a way to fix this, and like Galeshot exists as the anti-stacking specialization, lots of players seem to wish they had access to. Just let the Ranger inherit boons granted to their pet by their allies, and let Cloudburst grant boons in a radius around your pet as well. This would absolutely need to come with the asterisk that the boons can't be received or granted twice, such as you and your pet receiving 5 seconds of quickness shouldn't result in your player character having 10 seconds of available quickness, nor the inverse with you granting 10 seconds to allied players off of 2 5-second applications. But if there's an elite specialization built around playing at range, it would be nice if it interacted with arguably the most defining system for endgame PvE period, boons, in such a way that players could still lean into the core fantasy of being a ranged damage dealer. This could honestly be a core ranger update, such as letting rangers inherit boons from their pets and having pets occupy the spot of the player in the squad boon priority order. But that might have other design ramifications, but in short, Galeshot should definitely have this, and other rangers could probably stand to have it as well. There's a lot of great ideas on Galeshot, and a lot to love, but there's some interactions that feel unconsidered, and the presence of a build path that cares about firing projectiles really pulls back the curtain on how dated and clunky some of Ranger's weapon options, primarily Longbow, really are in 2025 Guild Wars 2. Don't let these criticisms trick you though. I am very excited for this elite specialization, and I think it's one of the most promising ones to come out of Visions of Eternity. Antiquary is a unique case. No other elite specialization in the game is so fundamentally random. This gives it a unique identity, and as such it speaks to an equally unique audience. I've played enough fighting games to know how popular random item characters are, from Faust in Guilty Gear, to Phoenix Wright in Marvel vs. Capcom 3, to Peacock and Skullgirls. People love the excitement they provide. As such, Antiquary has a lot of unique design considerations it needs to solve to do so, especially in a PvE context. Problems such as, how do we make a fundamentally random DPS operate with some level of predictable output? How do we make the penalty of bad RNG not dramatically neuter group play? And should we let the group help the Antiquary fight through their bad RNG, or is that a risk that should fundamentally come with playing the Antiquary? I won't be trying to solve all of these problems, because any solution that I provide isn't going to offer much, when the only thing that matters here is getting it into the hands of the player base to officially get a litmus test for how much RNG people are willing to tolerate, and how people manage that in practice. There are, however, a few things I do want to speak on. Firstly, the internal build variety of the Antiquary poses a unique question. Usually, when there's multiple viable playstyles for a given elite specialization, you can tune the numbers of the mutually exclusive tools in such a way that they come out the other side of the equation with roughly similar performance. For example, Warrior Relic Condition Willbender and Fractal Relic Condition Willbender are very similar in performance in almost every context, and if that wasn't the case, ANet could look to the tools they don't share in common, namely Scepter, and adjust the build separately using the mutually exclusive balance lever. However, because the two primary build paths Antiquary has, the high variance initiative flooding DPS build with Prolific Plunderer, Enterprising Aristocrat, and Prodigious Pincher, as well as a lower variance build focused on front-loading modifiers with Exhilarating Ephemera and Combat High, they have their work cut out for them if they have any intent on making both builds reasonably performant in PvE. Obviously, there's bound to be crosstalk between these two builds, and depending on what one needs, they might steal traits from one another, but I think these are the two primary builds ANet has designed for Antiquary. There's one small problem. Thief already has elite specs better suited to both of these things. Well, okay, there's a bit more to it. First, the modifier loading playstyle of Combat High compares pretty unfavorably to Power Daredevil at a mathematical level. This is a balanced criticism, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but just to illustrate the concern, Power Daredevil has 10% increased damage from Weakening Strikes, 15% from Havoc Specialist, and 15% from Bounding Dodger. That's a collective 40% damage modifier that it is able to sustain at all times. For the Antiquary, Exhilarating Ephemera is 15%, and Combat High is 30%. All told, that's a 45% damage modifier, but you lose 3% of that value every 2 seconds, meaning that by the end of the cooldown on Crit Snatch, Antiquary has lost 27% of their total damage modifiers. Ultimately, you would just be spending 4 seconds of that time with higher total modifiers than Powered Daredevil. That's pretty egregious, and the extra 5% at the very start of your rotation doesn't really do much to make up for that, since Thief can't really load a ton of other temporary modifiers concurrently. If it could, that might be quite powerful, given that's the sort of numbers-juicing burst that's led Soul Beast to be such a threat in endgame PvE content for however many years at this point, but Thief, as it stands, just isn't built for it. I do like this direction for Thief, to be clear. It's needed a bursty power build for a very long time, and Combat High is ANet's first attempt at gesturing towards that for the profession. It just needs a lot more access to numbers to load under Combat High for things to go well for a bursty power Thief build, because even pending buffs to the trait, Combat High threatens to largely be a relatively stable power damage build without additional support. So what's the problem with the Prolific Plunderer build? This Thief build largely compares to Maleficent 7 Deadeye in that it's trading modifiers for tremendous initiative access. That's a strategy we have seen be very successful in Deadeye historically. Deadeye is absolutely one of those elite specializations that threatens to be broken at a moment's notice, and Maleficent 7 is often the culprit. And to be clear, that's super cool. I like that the trait not built on damage modifiers, but just raw resource access, competes so directly with the absolute volume of modifiers Daredevil has. But there's a few problems there. Firstly, you need to be able to spend that initiative. And when the artifacts you're using all have cast times, variable cast times no less, it's hard to leverage the glut of initiative you have access to. But that's fine, you can fine-tune the amount of initiative you have access to on the build via traits and whether or not you bring stuff like Crit Scuffle. The other issue, however, is just in how much strength needs to be injected into each artifact to make that trade-off worth engaging in. Obviously, Meticulous Custodian is capable of giving each artifact that power, but when you're building your initiative flooding playstyle around primarily only using artifacts, what's the point of the initiative you're gaining in the first place? Neither of these is an unmanageable flaw, and a lot of this is balance, something I said I didn't want to get into at the very start of this video, but I want to draw attention to Prolific Plunderer because there's an internal tension between copious artifact access and copious initiative, and Antiquary doesn't really have a way to reconcile that tension within its kit. Some unique way to spend excess initiative would go a long way towards making these two coexisting parts of the artifact spam initiative flooding playstyle more cohesive, and for Combat High, I really want Thief to have a successful bursty power damage build. The class needs it, it's been starved for it for a very long time, and it makes me very happy to see it getting deliberate nods in that direction in its design. I just think that it needs a bit more help from elsewhere in Thief's toolkit to achieve that goal. Lastly, there's an inherent problem with two parallel build paths that are so numerically difficult to tune relative to one another. Why play the one you prefer if the other vastly outperforms it? Obviously, play the one that's most fun for you, but Guild Wars 2 actually has another way to directly reward players for playing with builds or playstyles that aren't bringing best-in-class damage. Boon DPS builds. Giving a weaker but unique and compelling DPS build or trait access to alacrity or quickness is massive and lets weaker traits justify their own existence in an endgame PvE context. Kinetic Accelerators gives Quick Scrapper a different texture to DPS Scrapper, or Willbender using Phoenix Protocol and Holy Reckoning gives that build a very different gameplay loops, since pure DPS builds are so defined by restorative virtues. So, if the Prolific Plunderer build ends up being relatively weak compared to Combat High in the long term, for instance, ANet does have the tools to push players into playing a directly weaker DPS build by rewarding its unique playstyle with access to one of the coveted primary build-defining boons. I hope they keep an eye on this space, because these two build paths are very promising directions for Antiquary and both deserve support and a reason to be played in endgame PvE. Antiquary is a genuinely very successful realization of its core fantasy, and I think it absolutely is going to find a very passionate audience. I also adore that Combat High is presumably a low variance playstyle, while Prolific Plunderer can be all in on leaning into the random nature of the artifacts. I just hope that the lack of support for Combat High, as well as the internal friction between Prolific Plunderer having too many resources to spend them all profitably, are both reconciled, either for the beta or in time for release. That said, ANet did a wonderful job with a very difficult concept, and I'm extremely excited to see how it plays out in practice. Paragon is deceptively strange. In a lot of ways, it fixes a lot of the issues that I had mentioned earlier with Luminary. There's a defined gameplay texture here, with the interactions between commands, their echoes, and the new adrenaline-consuming skills in the chants. There's a whole host of ways that traits could interact with each of them, and that's really promising. Not to mention the fact that Paragon finally provides warrior players an intended heal specialization to sink their teeth into. Heal Berserker has landed in a pretty good spot, but with Heal Alacrity being a notable hole in the spec given that Heal Bladeshorn doesn't really have access to many of the tools it might need, Paragon finally fills that gap. At the same time, however, its execution as both a warrior spec with a reasonable build variety, and as one that's likely designed specifically to be the intended warrior heal build, it leaves a lot to be desired. We've had a pure healing and support elite specialization in the game before too, Druid, and, as ANet themselves established, Druid was too narrow on its own to not justify a DPS build, so they gave Druid Blood Moon, and now it's absolutely a build that does very well in endgame content and justifies its own existence with very little trait budget committed towards it. While a power DPS build would be redundant with Warrior's myriad other options, that hasn't really been an issue prior to now for the class, so I fail to see how a power DPS or alacrity DPS build for Paragon really changes that. First, the traits. Paragon suffers from the same problems in this regard as Luminary, with a lot of its traits covering a very narrow band of the sorts of things the spec needs to care about. Often, 2 of the 3 traits in a given tier are focused on providing very similar outputs. The Adept line is a particular victim of this, where you get concentration and healing power from Calming Tongue, but you also get healing and boons from Call to Action. Liberating Liaise is largely a PvP trait, so it's reasonable to leave it largely unchanged, but one of the prior 2 traits really should at least give a nod towards the damage builds, not just providing more boon access. The Master tier traits have the same issue as well, where all 3 traits are strictly support focused. Reverberation and Brisk Pacing are both different vehicles that primarily provide boon output. Although Reverberation can provide damage, the commands and their echoes aren't really tuned for their offensive presence. I'll touch more on this later. And Invigorating Tempo is yet more healing. It just feels lacking. And lastly, the Grandmasters. Usually, Grandmaster traits are big, impactful traits, granting access to a playstyle-altering adjustments to a class's core toolkit. But here we get 3 traits that touch refrains? Self-boons from refrain, allied boons from refrain, and different boons from refrains. Granted, Enduring Refrain does change Paragon's relationship to motivation, which does have promise, but the spec has so many resources to tap into for interesting and unique play patterns that just aren't adequately explored, and it leads to a very promising elite spec, potentially falling flat in time for the beta. Lots of this could be fixed by tapping into other parts of the spec, such as motivation allowing access to higher level bursts for a DPS trait, or letting a clever heal Paragon sustain a particularly valuable echo by weaving chance throughout its play. But as it stands, it's just not reaching far enough into the systems already offered by Paragon. Going more specifically into one of these Grandmasters, Feverish Pulse gives me some pause. More specifically, by tying Alacrity output to it, Paragon ends up becoming a boon support more built around active and frenetic boon management, rather than specific and considered play. Now, there's nothing wrong with a boon build having an increased pace of play, but that ends up making Alacrity Paragon builds, specifically Heal Alacrity Paragon, rather similar to Heal Berserker, a build whose play pattern already more closely mirrors a DPS's rotational structure and pace of play more than most other healers. Granted, Heal Berserker is cool and quite fun. It has a small audience of players that really enjoy the unique way it operates relative to those other healers, but if Paragon is here to offer playstyle diversity to Warrior, why not make chant management something a bit slower and more considered? That's something not common to Warrior, and it's something that Paragon is positioned to provide to the class. Granted, this design could be fixed somewhat by increasing the amount of alacrity generated by this, but that doesn't solve the underlying concern, and could also prove to be a complicating factor if alacrity DPS Paragon is something they want to support, rather than just heals. Now for the skills. Far more involved and talented Warrior players have spoken to this, but lots of the Paragon skills very closely mirror core Warrior skills and don't really offer enough on their own terms to be compelling. Find Their Weakness is very similar to 4 Grey Justice, except it doesn't provide Fury. Never Surrender does things already provided by doubled standards coupled with Banner of Resistance, and On Your Knees, the only pure damage skill Paragon provides to Warrior, doesn't contribute enough to make up for the lack of modifiers available through its traits. Lots of that is balance, not design, but it does show a bit of a loose design thread. There's pieces here that want to support damage-centered builds, but they don't have immediate homes. Lastly, this is less of a design concern but more so one of theme, but as we'll see later with Ritualist, ANet has mentioned the importance of maintaining a lot of the identifying features and gameplay components of the Guild Wars 1 professions that are now translating into elite specializations. With that focus, prioritizing ways to make Spear uniquely powerful in Paragon would absolutely make sense and help lean into the desired flavor for the class. Spear scales its damage with burst level, the same way that Axe and Greatsword do, so making Paragon yet another Warrior spec that doesn't have access to its level 3 bursts runs the risk of it not bringing Spear, and as a result, not feeling sufficiently Paragon. This isn't a design failing, more just something that feels like a missed opportunity for one of the 2 specs deliberately designed to resemble and evoke a very popular Guild Wars 1 playstyle to a lot of people who have felt its absence for over a decade. There's a lot of very cool and flavorful systems that Paragon has access to. Motivation is a fun and flavorful balance lever, commands and their echoes are an awesome evolution of shouts in Guild Wars 2, refrains are very clever, though admittedly a bit similar to an active Troubadour instrument. However, there's also a lot of disparate elements that feel left hanging, which could be brought together to form a more cohesive identity. A lack of level 3 bursts for DPS Paragon, lackluster damage traits in general, overall trait homogeneity, a potential lackluster playstyle for Alacrity builds, and redundant Paragon skills that don't offer much to what Warrior already has by default. Paragon is largely a success, but it definitely needs a fair bit of work pending the final release of Visions of Eternity to give it a more unique playstyle and offering among what Warrior currently brings to the table. Ritualist is a spec I'm particularly excited about. While I'm most known for my Willbender, I did get my start with the Guild Wars franchise playing Spirit Spam Rit as a young kid, so I have a lot of love in my heart for this profession. I'm very excited to see both another healer for Necromancer, as well as another damage spec designed specifically around power damage, definitely two things Necromancer needs more access to. And honestly, a lot of its traits seem very well realized as well, more so than most elite specializations in the beta. There's a very specific intention for each trait, and that gives Ritualist a lot of interesting build crafting decisions to make. The issues are emergent from its interactions with other traits in Necromancer's arsenal, unfortunately. Power builds have largely been defined by the legacy of Reaper for a very long time, and while Power Harbinger does exist and is quite a good build, structurally its rotation is very similar to Reaper's. Ritualist has the potential to break that traditional Shroud rotational structure, with its Grandmaster Lingering Spirits giving it a very short Shroud loop, and instead focusing most of its power budget on using weapon skill cooldowns. Unfortunately, core Necromancer doesn't really have the traits to facilitate this. Two of the best traits in Soul Reaping, Sinister Shroud and Death Perception, are both best used by builds that want to spend a good bit of time in Shroud, so a build that wants to leave Shroud early doesn't really get to benefit much from either, which puts a lot of pressure on Ritualist as a trait line to pick up the missing slack. This could be managed by either letting Lingering Souls snapshot not just your life force value, but also your stats from inside of the Shroud, or some very careful buffs to death magic that synergize directly with the build that summons spirits and minions, for instance. But even if death magic synergizes with Ritualist spirits the same way that Rit's Essence Blast and Explosive Growth directly interact with them, the trait line has proven not to be a particularly compelling option for Necromancer. It is an interesting and unique place they could inject some extra strength into Ritualist if they wanted to. Granted, none of this is an issue though, more just something that stands to make Ritualist's play pattern less unique in PvE relative to its peers in Power Reaper and Power Harbinger. So let's run with the assumption we take the other Grandmaster trait that could feasibly contribute to damage, Soul Twisting. A Soul Twisting rotation would likely be quite cool, but it would be yet another Power Reaper styled build with a standard Shroud based rotation structure and a relatively flat power damage profile compared to Reaper and Power Harbinger. That's fine too, but if this is the direction ANet wants to take the spec, I'd like to see some attention focused on letting this build have a burstier power damage option, just to give it some sort of unique value. Whether that's a few initial damage modifiers the spec can load up all up front to let it spike its damage, some way to precast its spirits before an encounter or phase, or some combination of the two, that would help a soul-twisting power ritualist be a bit more unique. A little bit of both approaches would likely do a lot for Rit, seeing as empowering spirits likely pushes power quickness ritualist to take soul twisting so it can help supplement its boon output by giving it an extra spirit to work with. Part of the reason why I spoke to Death Magic's potential synergy with Lingering Spirits is because focusing on that trait's potential as a pure DPS build does help distinguish the playstyles between it and a boon DPS Ritualist, one that would need to linger in Shroud longer to maximize its boon output. Ritualist has the design space within it to support both of these rotation structures as different builds, so I think it makes sense to lean into the two different DPS archetypes that those Grandmaster traits seem like natural fits in, and enable them both separately. Now, Heal Ritualist. This build looks awesome, and ANet did a fantastic job bringing it to Guild Wars 2. I also like that it'll likely spend less time in Ritualist Shroud and more time extracting value from weapon skills. That maps really closely onto how both variants of Ritualist played in the original Guild Wars. It's also less tied to any particular weapon option than Heal Scourge on account of having so much might available to it from Anguish, which makes it a very flexible heal build to boot. Honestly, I don't really have a whole lot of notes on its design. It's extremely well executed. The one thing that stands out to me here is that protection is tied to all of the spec's biggest healing skills, so finding a way to weave more sources of protection throughout Heal Ritualist's kit would go a long way towards enabling it to actually use those big heals reactively, but that's relatively minor on a spec that otherwise does a great job of achieving its core fantasy. Ritualist is extremely thoughtfully designed. ANet said they wanted to make this spec feel like Guild Wars 1 Ritualist as much as they were able to, and I absolutely think they succeeded. There is some concern here that the best version of DPS Ritualist is too similar to other power builds on Necromancer, but there's enough room to tune it to make it feel unique in its own right there as well. Heal Ritualist feels sufficiently different and cares about enough different parts of what Ritualist brings to the table to be a compelling heal build on its own. And it's nice that Necromancer has access to an intended and powerful quickness healing spec finally. I'm very excited to see where this spec goes in the future, and it's one both myself and many other players will likely enjoy a great deal. I love what they're doing with Conduit. While some players might be worried that Conduit seems much more boring or has a less discernible power fantasy to specs like Vindicator or Herald, there's a lot of moving pieces inside it that should be super fun to sink your teeth into. It's got a great suite of utility skills, all of which seem to have reasonable energy costs, which should help the spec feel flexible into end-game content, something Revenant often isn't because of how expensive those utility skills tend to be. But there's also some fun interactions between Charging Affinity and the way that informs Conduit's rotational structure, since you won't be able to get Cosmic Wisdom immediately underneath your big upkeep skill, like Impossible Odds, so it'll likely play uniquely to its peers as well. I do have some concerns about where that flexibility is and isn't available to the spec, but broadly, there's a lot of cool and interesting pieces here that should make for a fun sandbox of trait interactions and buildcraft, so on that metric, it's absolutely a success. Let's go over those new skills. The defining function of these new legend skills are their resonance effects, synergies that emerge from what your non-Raza legend is. So for example, Beguiling Haze becomes a ground-targeted Shadow Step and cleaves with Shiro slotted. Each skill has really interesting available synergies as well. For instance, having a refreshable Shadow Step that you can cast 3 times helps a lot with reapplying Paether Relic's effect, which is obviously quite potent, but it scales even better with the amount of raw stats Conduit has access to. I'm not sure if this is enough to compete directly with Vindicator's Raw Burst, but it is super interesting. This also lets Conduit flex their available utility in a way other Revenant legends can't, and that's just really novel for the spec. Unfortunately, in PvE, the only legends you'll likely ever see the resonance effects on are Shiro and Malix. Ventari has no primary boon, and its support boon access is quite low, so heal Conduit is kind of out the window, and Jalis doesn't have any meaningful way to make up for his lost damage. To be clear, that's fine, and there's plenty of moving pieces elsewhere on the kit, and I don't want to specifically suggest yet another boon build. I am a big fan of boon builds creating space for alternate playstyles within an elite specialization, even if they're not necessary, but by the nature of PvE caring about different outputs versus PvP modes, these two legends feel largely left behind. If the spec has enough variety, that might be an acceptable cost to pay, but some players might find that limiting. Conversely, with Revenant lacking individual flexibility, something especially relevant for boon builds because of how legends work, it might be worth trying to inject that here so Revenant healers and boon supports can make intricate decisions regarding how they adjust their build and play on a fight-by-fight basis like the other more flexible healers might. Outside of that concern, however, the skills are really interesting and the resonance effects are super fun and clever. I like this suite of skills a lot too, so overall a pretty big success. Just one with an asterisk worth paying attention to and designing around. The traits are super fun and very number crunchy. While lots of specs have traits that might make immediately obvious playstyle changes, many of the ways Conduit's traits create interesting decision points for build crafters and such are from how numbers interact in this game. Conductive Armaments is a great trait to have if it's hard to get a meaningful amount of affinity for some legends, namely Shiro. But if we don't need it, there's a lot of potential in Expanded Consciousness and its interaction with some other traits that care about Cosmic Wisdom. I spoke to this briefly earlier, but for example, with 270 power coming from Form of the Assassin when buffed by Boundless Knowledge, large percentage modifiers such as Relic of Paetha have a proportionally larger impact on Conduit, and those interactions are going to have big effects on how builds are theory crafted and optimized. Recurring Insight and Twofold Embodiment have really cool synergy in this department too, so depending on the available energy budget, the Twofold Embodiment build has some cool different ways it can be played. Multiple ways to interact with cornerstone traits makes for builds that have the ability to actually change and grow with changes in balance and such, so this helps the spec be somewhat future-proofed in that department too. And that's not even the only build path either. Perpetual Wisdom provides 25 energy when played around, and that's an effect we've seen on Revenant before in Charged Mists, an incredibly potent trait for both energy-intensive power and Condi builds. The ability to stack these two traits lets Rev see 100% energy every legend swap, something incredibly powerful and absolutely something that very energy-hungry weapons such as Spear can take advantage of. Even if this doesn't end up proving immediately potent, it's a cool feature that's completely unique to the Conduit, and giving specs unique things to be the best at helps each stand out individually. Conduit might not be for everyone, but for the people that really like to sit down and math out exactly what the optimal thing to do is at any given moment, I expect this spec to be incredibly engaging. And even for people that aren't as excited by that sort of thing, I suspect this build's rotation and playstyle will end up so unique to other Revenant specs that the less spreadsheet-inclined players will absolutely still enjoy it. Amalgam is a novel approach to engineer. We've seen NG divorce themselves from toolbelt skills in the past via Mechanist, but by supplementing the removal of those toolbelts with a skill type they're expected to engage with more frequently, unlike Signets, Amalgam fundamentally changes its relationship to its available skills. Some skills you may take just for their potent toolbelts are less compelling. That's really cool, and the way it recontextualizes your relationship to your profession skills and how you consider them reminds me a lot of Soul Beast, a spec I think most players would consider a design triumph. This is a really successful and compelling evolution of that paradigm. Amalgam's traits are also an interesting counterpoint to the other specs I'd spoken on as having far too many defensive traits. The adept traits here are all defensive, but they're defensive in ways that support the core fantasy of the spec, its adaptability, and they aren't crowding out slots from other high-impact traits. The Master and Grandmaster traits Amalgam brings to the table are incredibly potent, and absolutely makes up for the opportunity cost I mentioned in the Luminary section. It's not a bad thing to have a tier of strictly defensive traits, you just need to make up for the cost you're paying in later trait design, and Amalgam absolutely succeeds at this. It might be worth making these defensive traits a bit more interesting and have more internal synergies. For example, Hardened Chrome might be more interesting if it also provided a boon that isn't basically 100% uptime in every endgame PvE group, but I'm not opposed to these traits being defensive at all. The later traits are extremely compelling. Carbolic Composition is a deceptive amount of condition application, given that half of the available offensive morph skills are multi-hit, and one of the defensive ones can potentially multi-hit an aggressive enough enemy. That might be enough hits to support that build archetype. Mercurial Tendencies seems like the trait power builds are most likely to bring, and I like that this gives Shield a potentially compelling home on a premier power build. Hammer is, unequivocally, the strongest general power weapon for Engineer right now, but Shield has by far the highest quantity of disables available to Engineer on a standard weapon, so there's a lot to key into that rewards bringing underserved weapons. I've mentioned this before, but weapon diversity is big, so having levers on your elite spec design that helps reward other weapons gives us that diversity that a lot of specs have seen go missing in the wake of weapons master training. There is some concern on whether or not Shield is worth it over Pistol, even with the high volume of cooldown reduction on Evolve, but that's a numbers problem that can be solved on a later date. What matters here is the fact that there is now a build that directly cares about something Shield is uniquely good at, which is very important for weapon diversity. Looking at the Grandmasters, Contagious Mutation has a potentially problematic interaction with Offensive Protocol Shred and Defensive Protocol Cleanse, allowing it to provide both alacrity and quickness, but it's not the first build to do that. Woolmender does have Feel My Wrath. I'm just not sure if the supporting pieces are there, but it is worth drawing attention to. Outside of that, it's very reminiscent of Leader of the Pack, and that trait is extremely iconic, so it makes sense to use a similar effect here. The other two are super interesting too. The interaction between Mercurial Tendencies and Symbiotic Synergy is super cool, and could lead to really fun rotations. And even without that interaction, the trait is just interesting on its own. Double Helix might be the most interesting for very short, phased fights where you just want to front-load a whole bunch of damage, something like Harvest Temple CM, but a lot of that value is likely contingent on whether or not the buff you gain from evolving twice in succession stacks with itself. It'd be awesome if it does though, and I'd love to see the beta play around with this function to see if it's something that can exist in the game in a healthy way. There's so many moving pieces here that it serves as a great example of a spec that doesn't need a primary boon, such as alacrity or quickness, associated with it. Boons are a very useful design tool if a spec has multiple parallel build paths, but one just isn't compelling on a raw numbers level. The player now has access to something worth having outside of DPS once it gets access to a primary boon. Amalgam thrives in its diversity. Every single aspect of the kit is tweakable to meet a fight or a squad at their exact needs. This is a super novel approach to Engineer, and one I think a lot of people will find engaging. There's so many moving pieces and so many interesting ways to tune to specialization that I think it's hard to imagine the spec not being one of the more popular ones following the release of the expansion. And it's extremely cool to see NG getting pushed in such a unique direction. ANet absolutely knocked it out of the park. ArenaNet has finally heard the cries of the fire wizards of the world and has decided to allow them to live out their fantasies of burninating the countryside, with a little friend to boot. Evoker is just a really compelling combination of some things people have wanted from Elementalist for a very long time: an elemental specialist and a wizard with a familiar. Interestingly, by giving players their desire for a more single-minded elite specialization, ANet has made one of the most unique and interesting elite specializations to date. By forcing the Evoker to specialize, rather than juggling evenly weighted attunes, it changes its relationship to traits, weapon sets, and even individual weapon cooldowns. This is super interesting. By defining what element is home for each build, each variant of the Evoker ends up being kind of its own mini elite spec, and that's a super novel design approach. To that end, CMC did mention eyeing autos as a way to charge up the Evoker's familiar skills, and I think it might be worth letting autos for your home attunement do this as a way to reinforce the relationship between unique weapon choices and the attunement they're likely to become attached to. For example, look at the difference in cast time between fire and water autos and earth and air autos on Dagger. The relative auto attack speed ends up becoming a potential influencing factor for which Evoker elements select which weapons, and that's something that pushes it into a really interesting layer of buildcraft. But, all in all, there's a lot of driving factors that might push players towards one weapon or away from another that aren't directly related to which one has the best coefficients directly, and that's always fun to see. It's hard to talk about any subsequent part of Evoker without going over its Grandmaster traits, since they're so transformative, so we'll briefly go over those before I touch on anything else. The easiest one is Familiar's Focus, which is functionally a 25% damage bonus to whatever your primary output is, strike damage, conduit damage, or healing. So I'll move on from this one, seeing that its impact is pretty intuitive. Next is Familiar's Blessing, whose largest impact is turning the spec into an Alacrity healer and a Quickness DPS, depending on if you're specialized in water or air. It's really cool that it's able to bring both boons, but they're relegated to different roles. But this spec is pretty standard, and outside of the short cooldown on re-entry to your preferred attunement, it should play more or less like a conventional Elementalist build. The last trait, however, is the one people seem to be the most excited for: Specialized Elements. This trait replaces all of your elements with whichever element you're specialized in, and activating your pet's empowered skill refreshes weapon skill cooldowns by 10 seconds. Important to note that these refreshed weapon skills charge your familiar skill, so this builds a feedback loop where you're rotating through your available weapon skills and familiar skills as quickly as you possibly can. This is a very cool and unique design. My only concern here is the UX of 4 identical attunement skills. There's not really a purpose to having these attunement buttons available anymore, but that's likely a problem that's more trouble than it's worth to solve. Now, let's do a quick once-over on the intended design for each specialized element. First, Fire is primarily focused on being a condition damage build, with its enhanced familiar skill spreading up to 9 stacks of burning from its target to adjacent enemies. Water is a heal build, with its enhanced familiar skill providing healing, cleanse, and CC. Air is a power DPS that builds up to an even more potent strike with the enhanced familiar skill. Lastly, Earth is a bruisery tank, and its enhanced skill CCs, cripples, and applies a bit of bleed. All of these paths are cool, flavorful, and make intuitive sense for each of these attunements, but I would like to cover some gaps each of these builds are missing. Fire Evoker is a pretty classic condition build, just a whole lot of burn output, and likely a reasonably high amount of strike damage as well, since Fire has historically been the hybrid damage attunement. This is fun, and it's especially compelling in a post-Inferno world, seeing as that trait has fundamentally transformed Fire Elementalist builds into power-scaling condition builds. This isn't something that changes how they play at a fundamental level, but by giving them new gearing opportunities and rewarding both power and condi damage concurrently, it's hard to imagine this variant being anything other than extremely popular. There's just 2 concerns I have with it. Firstly, by being locked to Fire Attune, Evoker has pitiful CC access outside of its elite skill, and that makes it hard for Fire Evokers to contribute meaningfully in group play. This would be less of an issue if Elementalist's utility skills outside of the Evoker elite provided a compelling amount of CC, but Evoker has a hard time participating in any break bars a fight asks for outside of that. That can be balanced around, but it bears mentioning. The other concern is that Conflagrate's value is only really particularly compelling in a cleave scenario. In a single target boss, you're not really getting any value from Conflagrate spreading the burn to enemies around them. It might be worthwhile having the damage or condition application of Conflagrate increase based on how few targets it's hitting to normalize the damage across cleave and non-cleave scenarios. But if the condition application of the skill is generous enough, this might not even be necessary. This build is awesome though, I'm really excited to see what becomes of it. Water Evoker is a very traditional healing build, and since Boon Evoker isn't attunement locked, it has access to the toolkits of the other elements as well: Fire's Might, Air's CC, and Earth's defensive boons, nominally at least. There's a large struggle for Water Evoker to access a lot of the key defensive boons that make heal builds work in PvE in the first place. For instance, Stability is expensive because it forces Water Evoker to take the Earth trait line to provide it reliably, and Aegis is completely absent. All of that also ignores the fact that Might takes far too much effort to generate, making its general boon profile quite fragile to disruption. I do like this build conceptually, but Elementalist's boon budget has been spread pretty thin for a while now, and Evoker forcing Ellie to specialize in one particular element makes this gap somewhat damning, especially when compared to just the absolute glut of boons builds like Heal Tempest and Heal Catalyst are able to easily provide. Water Evoker needs special consideration for it to function as a healer in PvE, since so much of what healers need to provide is relegated to attunements and trait lines Water Evoker has a hard time accessing, and no weapon completely fills the gaps well enough. I really do hope its kit gets filled out though. Heal Elementalist is one of my favorite ways to personally engage with the spec, and I'm always happy to see another cool Heal Ellie build. Air Evoker is just a very standard but super cool traditional power spec. While Fire has very stable power damage coming off of its power scaling conditions, Air should be the traditionally bursty power build available to Evoker. It's also the hardest one to evaluate, however, as Fresh Air is one of the single most impactful traits Elementalist has, and for Evoker it could either be completely broken or it might do literally nothing. This is something I'm absolutely going to need to revisit after the beta, but there's a lot of potential here for something completely insane in an incredibly cool way, so I'm going to be keeping an eye on it. And even if Fresh Air doesn't have any particularly interesting interactions with Evoker, this build should be plenty fun regardless. Earth Evoker is the red-headed stepchild, however. As we've been over a few times so far with the prior elite specs, there's not really room for a bruisery defensive build in PvE, so it's likely that the poor Toad won't have anywhere to call home. This is fixable though. Refocus some of the damage budget on Earth Evoker away from strikes and into damaging conditions like bleed and maybe even poison. The durations wouldn't even need to be very high for PvP modes, but by adding it there at all, it becomes an available lever to make Earth Evoker into a potentially real build in PvE, so Toad lovers like Trig himself won't be left out of all of the fun. It still has value too, since Fire Attune's condition damage all scales with power. Earth Evoker has very different interactions with its traits and gear, so Fire and Earth, while both are Condi damage builds in name, will likely end up being night and day for one another, and I think that's worth the effort to give the little Toad somewhere to call home. Evoker is a deceptively complex spec, and it's a spec that I think covers a very broad range of playstyles and players very successfully, so I do expect to see a very large number of people giving the spec a shot both during the beta and well after it. It's good practice in design to keep an eye on things that are popular, but not quite up to snuff with the other available tools, because it's indicative of an underserved audience. I think we saw ANet trying to serve this audience with Inferno, and now the players that want to engage more with an element individually are going to have an entire elite specialization to sink their teeth into with Evoker, and I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of love for it for quite a while. While I've definitely been plenty critical during this video, there's one thing I do want to reiterate here at the end. All of these elite specializations are fantastic designs. And while some are more complete and compelling in their current state than others, they're all incredibly promising and unique offerings for each class, and that's what matters most in a beta like this. There's great reimaginings of classic profession flavor, there's fun new playstyles injected into classes to make them feel fresh, there's new roles available to professions that haven't historically had access to them, and 2 popular returning professions are getting new life as elite specs. That's amazing, and I think this batch of specializations is incredibly strong, especially given that everything we just went over is relevant to these specializations in just PvE. Not to mention that many of these specs are exciting for completely different reasons in PvP or World v World, and there's absolutely no way I could have gone over all of that. In the past, there's always been elite specializations that I think most players would consider underbaked due to that focus on PvP. Not mechanically, though some in this batch are, but instead have a poorly considered flavor, and that ends up contributing to growing pains within these specs that don't have an audience. Willbender, Herald, Spellbreaker, Scrapper, Untamed, and Harbinger, for instance, all took quite a while to find an audience and a home in PvE, but with this new batch, I don't really think any of them have that same fundamental concern, in any mode. That's incredibly impressive. This game has a lot of life, and if the designers were able to ship a group of specializations this inspired, this transformative, and this able to meet player demands this far into the game's lifecycle, I think that deserves celebrating just as much as it deserves critiquing. And I'd like to give a huge shoutouts to the players who proofread this, either as an editor or to make sure that this video is representative of more than my own personal feelings on these specs. Thank you to Kestrel, Windfreeze, Tipcat, Rainbow Turtle, Iskarel, Darshi, Dan, Zargle, Maru, Sin, and Cora for their feedback, assistance, and guidance. While the opinions in this video are completely my own, I couldn't have done this without their help. For those of them that were interested, I've linked their profiles on various platforms below, so if you're interested in more specific guidance from some incredibly talented players, I cannot advocate for these people enough. Thank you so much for watching.